Hi there. Welcome to this mini-series on what works for women at work. I'm Evelyn Axelrod, and I'll be your guide on this exciting adventure. By day, I'm the VP of the Career Foundation, an innovative nonprofit organization driving inclusive employment across Canada. Personally, I'm interested in exploring a little more about what works for women like us so we can scale learnings and accelerate gender parity. I'm all about solutions, so join me on this year-long journey and get ready to hear inspiring stories, practical lessons, and powerful mindset shifts that will create leadership transformation. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to What Works for Women at Work. Today I am joined by my friend and colleague Surabhi Jain. Surabhi is a highly accomplished leader in workforce development and inclusion, as well as nonprofit consulting. Welcome, Surabhi, to What Works for Women at Work.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. I'm so excited for this conversation, one of my favorite topics.
I love it. Surabhi, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in the world to advance strategic leadership for women.
Yeah, absolutely. So, two different things, I guess. So, I'm the executive director of the Workforce Funder Collaborative. It's a philanthropic organization based in Toronto, where 8 funders have pooled resources, and we are operating at the intersection of systems change, workforce development, and philanthropy. Outside of the Funder Collaborative, I also run a women's leadership program called Women in Power, where we bring together white and racialized women, Black, Indigenous, and other women of color for 9 weeks, 90 minutes each week, to come and talk about their experiences around systemic inequities like patriarchy, race, gender. And essentially, the goal is for women to hear from each other. So we use a storytelling approach to hope for, you know, to influence narrative change amongst women and move them towards inclusive leadership and allyship. So we've done 4 cohorts so far. We've had 60 women roughly graduate, and I'm excited to see what happens in the future.
Wow, the things that you're doing are very innovative. I mean, bringing funders together to think strategically about what nonprofits need, what workforce development needs, but also the bringing of diverse people together, white women, women of color, like those are really innovative approaches you're taking. I mean, that's systems change. What are you trying to change in terms of leadership here? Like,
Ah,
yeah, in terms of like bringing that strategic lens in terms of leadership.
yeah. So I say that, when I started Women in Power, the reason I started it was I was sick and tired of people saying that white women were gatekeepers.
Mm.
And in many instances, they may be gatekeepers, but I had not had that experience for the most part in my career. So what I wanted was for other women of color to be able to understand the white women's experiences, but at the same time, for white women to understand what women of color go through. What does racism look like? Are they complicit in racism? Are they a stand-byer in racism? Are they upholding patriarchal institutions? And if they are, how do they change that? And how do we learn from each other's lived experiences to navigate these systemic inequities? So from influencing leadership perspective, I would say my goal is for organizations, individuals to come together to hear how things are being done in other institutions, pick up the good pieces, leave the bad, and then start changing your own organizations and institutions. And I'm a firm believer that you can be a leader at any level. You don't have to be a CEO. You don't have to be a vice president. You don't have to be a COO. You can be a leader even if you are a case manager. You can be a leader even if you are a director. You can be a leader as a project officer. But leadership requires you to really do some inner work, to really think about how you're showing up. Leadership, I think, is a persona, not a title.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I think what you're doing is so aligned with what I want to be talking about. It sounds like let's identify what's working
And then how do we scale that across the board to make other things work better? And for me, what you're really doing is thinking differently about what works in workforce development and bringing the right stakeholders together to, have the various different perspectives and make positive impact at a systemic level. And the same thing in terms of diversity and inclusion, just so that,
Exactly.
yeah, that really strategic thinking is so critical, and there's a gap. There's a gap of it happening.
And I would say something that we don't think about often, Evelyn, is context,
Mm-hmm.
right? We do not contextualize experiences. We think, for example, if Evelyn has had a really good run in the nonprofit sector, then every woman of color might have that, or everybody at that level might have that. But there's certain contextual experiences, circumstances, opportunities that you may have had that made sure you had a good experience. Maybe you had good bosses, maybe you had good staff, maybe you had good mentors. And the same applies to systems change, and the same applies to workforce development, and the same applies to programming. When you think about programming and innovation, it works because the context let that idea germinate. The
Mm-hmm.
context was helpful, right? Like, so why is the plant growing? The plant is growing because everything is working. It has the nutrients, it has the soil, the roots have taken in, and that is why this plant is able to grow. And that is how we need to think about systems change and leadership. It is contextualized. You have the right conditions. And when you don't have the right conditions, what do you do? If the plant is not growing or it's drying up, you give it the nutrients and you give it the soil that it needs to grow. That is how leadership is. If you're not flourishing as a leader, you have this persona, you have the qualities, but you're not able to flourish, what can you do? Where do you get those strategic inputs from? Where do you figure out what you're doing wrong? Where do you need to change? And that is why I say that inner work, learning from somebody else, hearing other people's experiences, changing your narrative, broadening your perspective, very important for you to flourish and grow as a leader.
Yeah, I love that. And you're applying such discipline and rigor to the thinking.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful. And you talk about inner work, Surabhi. Tell us a little bit more about your own experiences and examples, if you will, when you initially thought something, was the best approach, but you went through it and you realized actually that's a really good learning experience, but it didn't work. So here's what I know worked, and you scaled that.
Yeah. I'll start with the inner work question and then come to the example. When I took up my job at the Workforce Funder Collaborative, I was moving away from an organization where I'd been for over 15 years. And I had started at the bottom of the organization and reached as high as I could in the organization, which was a senior director level. So you can imagine 15 years in an organization, you build credibility, you build trust, you build some sort of a rapport, you build a name for yourself. So I left all of that in the US and moved to Canada to start an organization from scratch, zero. This was just a kernel of an idea. We are six funders. We want to do something in systems change and workforce. Go create an organization. So that is the example of starting something from scratch. And I'll continue with that theme. So the first 6 months was, a learning experience. You're starting something new. I've never started an organization. So this was quite entrepreneurial. This was almost like, you know, venture capitalism, trying to find money, trying to fund this. We had some dedicated funds, but also how do I grow it? How do I get more money? Move beyond a certain financial threshold. I was doing gap analysis, trying to figure out where we need to be in the sector. Where do I need to situate ourselves as an organization? So we're not replicating, we're not duplicating. How do we complement other funders? Where are the gaps in their funding? What are they not funding for that we should be funding for? So this took about 6 months. But what it also did is it tanked my confidence in many ways.
Mm.
And the reason was because I had to start from scratch. I had no community here. I moved during the pandemic. There was no rapport. There was no trust. I was an import from the US. Why would people trust me? So that really tanked my confidence. And I didn't realize how much that social capital and the confidence that I had in my old job would be needed or depleted how quickly in this job. So one of the things I did is I got an executive coach. And first thing I told my executive coach was, teach me how to be a leader and how I can become more confident. And she said, I can't do that. That's something within you. And so that is where my journey of inner work started. And I've been doing it for 4 years now. I've had that executive coach for 4 years. So the first year started with really understanding why I was looking for validation outside. The second year started about, what does confidence look like for me? Where am I drawing this confidence? The third year was all about, how do I find my voice? Now that I'm confident, I know that I don't need external validation. I rely on my gut. How do I voice my opinion? Where do I get that strength? How do I not feel afraid? And the fourth year is really, how am I navigating choppy waters? Whether those are difficult conversations, whether that's managing a staff, I have my voice, but it has to be used in the right way. So do you see the progression or the depth of that inner work? And along the way, I will say the Funder Collaborative has given me a lot of learnings. So for example, we launched a capacity building program because I had done a lot of capacity building programs in the US. They were cohort based. We launched that in 2021 and we failed 100% in that. We put people through an 8-week training and or 6-week training, and then we asked them to apply for funding based on the training they had received. And we had money to give for 5 organizations, to fund 5 organizations at $200,000 level. We funded one at $125,000. And that was a great learning experience for me because it taught me that what works in US does not work here. Because I had forgotten context is important. I did not contextualize it for Toronto. I contextualized it for US. I got trainers from the US. I had all the examples from Canada. And I had half the team was from the US because content was coming from the US, and half the team was from Canada because facilitation was happening in Canada. And all the grantees were in Canada. But it was not contextualized. I thought I had contextualized it, but it wasn't. So I went back to the drawing board and I said, what is going to work? What are people hungry for? If we cannot give these large grants, what can we give? Well, nobody's giving small grants. Nobody's giving money for planning. So let's give money for planning. Let's try and see if that's going to work, and then we can move towards bigger investments. Let's see if they have all their ducks in it. What do we need to make sure these planning grants are successful? Capacity building. How does that need to happen? One-on-one. So I started meeting with all the grantees on a monthly basis, and not to check and not to see the progress, but more like, how can I help you? How can I be that consultant? How can I give you free 1 hour of consulting so you can be successful in your project implementation? So it was a lot of pivoting, I would say, but recognizing when and where you pivot.
Yeah, and it sounds like you kept interrogating the thinking, interrogating the process to
Mm-hmm.
to make sure, like, really asking the difficult questions of yourself to make sure that you're elevating the conversation, you are programming specifically for the solution that you're trying to, or the outcome you're trying to achieve.
Totally. And for me, the one thing that was clear from the beginning was I need to center the grantee in this conversation and not myself. It wasn't about me. It's about the grantee. And if I want to make sure the grantees are successful, I need to meet them where they are. This is not I meet them halfway. This is I meet them where they are. So I have to walk the extra mile because they already are doing so much. Nonprofit organizations are doing a lot. It is incredibly awful, stupid of me to expect that they're going to walk to me and follow my process. But what I need to do is figure out how I can follow their process and how I can amplify their process, how I can show them the pivot points that they can see because they are 10 feet under the ground doing this work. And they're so deeply buried in this work that they don't have time to come out and see what those pivot points are. But I have the luxury of hovering at 30,000 foot. So I need to come down to that negative 10 foot, right, where they are and say like, oh, this is the pivot point I see. Help them see those pivot points and then fly back out to 30,000 foot and see how they're going to implement it.
Yeah. It is really all about the thinking, the mindset, the pivot points, like you say, because nonprofits, like we're operating in deficits all the time, deficit
Yeah,
financial situations, resources, and mindset. And I mean, we always talk in the nonprofit space, there's abundance, but it's like manifestation. It takes an organization like yours to come in and say, we see you, we value what you're doing. Here's what we can offer you in terms of thinking differently to be able to get different outcomes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's drill down a little bit more in terms of, thank you for the examples you've used in terms of your own sort of your move to Canada, which was brave and courageous. It,
Yeah, I have no idea how I did it now.
Yeah, in the pandemic,
Yeah,
as well. So that took a lot, I'm sure. But it tells a lot about you in terms of the risks that you take, and I guess the confidence that you had before making that shift in the skill sets, the intellectual agility you had, because you understood what you had to offer and knowing that you can take those best strengths and move it into a new environment and figure that
absolutely.
out, right? Can you share a little bit more about that courage and how you sort of reinforce that every time to make such a jump?
Oh God, that's a loaded question, Evelyn. So I think the one thing I'm very confident is my knowledge. And I know I have, well, let's be honest, I've been in the business for a little over 20 years. The one thing I know really well is workforce development. That's what I've been breathing and living the last 20 years. I know ins and outs. That was what my master's thesis was all about. How do we get more women in non-traditional jobs? How do we remove some of the barriers? And guess what? 20 years later, you pick up that thesis and read it now, nothing has changed. Those barriers still exist. So I know for a fact that there's work that still needs to be done, right? I haven't at least done myself out of a job or a business right now because there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Women still face the same barriers. So I think I always knew that I have the knowledge. And the only thing that was changing for me was the context. I was moving from Chicago, managing programs nationally, to Toronto. So the scope was going to get much smaller and tighter. And I just had to really learn what was happening in Toronto and the systems in Canada and Ontario. So I think that kind of confidence and belief in your own skill set is really important to take decisions about your career and what that next jump is going to look like. My executive coach always talks about S curves. And she says, when you get to the top of that S and you have to jump to the next S, what helps you is the amount of confidence you have in yourself,
Mhm.
right? And that's true. When you're jumping from, as kids, we would jump from one ledge to another. And why were we able to do it? Because we knew we had confidence that I'm going to be able to jump and not break a bone. And if I did break a bone, so what, right? As you grow older, you lose that because now you're so much more aware of your surroundings, of things happening around you. You just don't have that confidence in your ability. You don't have the safety net to fall back on. And that doesn't necessarily mean financial. It can mean emotional, it can mean social, it can mean physiological, psychological, mental, whatever you want to say. We just don't build enough of that agility, enough of that resilience, enough of that confidence in ourselves. So I like to tell people that I'm a risk taker. I love taking risks, but I always take calculated risks. I know how far I can fall, right? So I know I'm not going to fall from a 50th floor to ground floor. That's not happening. I'm only going to let myself fall 5 floors, 10 floors that I know I can climb back. So I think building that muscle and building that support system, and whether that's internal or external, is really
Wow, I've learned so much just in your analogies there, because what you've identified is that while confidence is intangible. And it's something often that we need to feel, which is a whole lesson in itself. Like, how do
Totally.
we build it, right? How do we build it?
Yeah.
But it's something that we feel. It actually can be a bridge as well, not just a jumping over an empty spot, but what are the pillars that you put down to be able to walk over to the
Totally.
next step, right? And so you talk about those support systems, like, are we as women or people thinking about what we need to be able to take that risk and make that jump,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly. Yeah, you've got it. You've nailed it. What are those pillars? And how do you actually, you don't have to jump them. You can actually walk.
Yeah, yeah. But I think we've always traditionally thought about confidence as this intangible feeling, but how do we make that real? And like, it's a huge concept for me right now. Like, you've just really given me like this blown my mind moment where now I want to create a confidence in a really tangible, physical way where people can feel like, yes, I have the resources I need emotionally and within my ecosystem to get me to the next step.
So I actually did that,
Oh,
just so
tell
you
me
know.
more.
Yeah. So I created what is called the wheel of confidence for myself. So you may have seen emotion wheels where there are different pies and you figure out what emotion you're feeling. I took that concept, I turned it around its head and said, let me create my wheel of confidence and figure out. I started with two things, right? Two halves of the circle. What are two things that give me confidence? And then when I was pretty confident or pretty stable, that having practiced those things, I was like, okay, now let's slice it further. Let's add two more things. And then when those four things became concrete, I said, okay, slice it further and what are those eight things that give me confidence? So now when I do coaching with women, I show them that and I say, I want you to figure out just two things. Create your wheel of confidence, but it can be two halves. And now 2 weeks later, let's work on it and let's figure out two more things. And for some people, 2 weeks is enough. For some, it's 2 months. For some, it's 2 years, and it doesn't matter. I took a full year to figure out what confidence is for me. And what it came down to is, how am I feeling in my gut? So, how do I feel when I say I want to do this interview with Evelyn? Is it making me a little quirky when I say that? Do I have no feelings? Does it bring joy? Am I like excited? That is what tells me how confident I am. That is my measure of confidence. Yours could be something else. Then I figured out, if I wanted to walk into a meeting really confident, I needed to have my hair blow dry, my hair looking all pretty, because that is what gave me confidence. It might sound silly, but that's what it was for me. For somebody, it could be I need to have a piece of brownie before I go in because I'm happy, I'm excited. It's whatever, right? We don't have to feel confident because of a situation, because of the person who's going to be there. And for some, it could be. But so many times we put our confidence in other people's hand and other people's situations that we forget what actually makes us happy and feel confident.
And create confidence.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you talked about conditions and variables earlier in terms of, context.
yeah,
It just, when you apply that concept to confidence, like, how do you create the conditions for you to be confident? Is it the blow dry hair? Is it the superficial things that you could start with? But also,
yeah,
like, what do you need to be feeling in the moment to
yeah,
say, yes, I'm ready for this?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
this is mind-blowing stuff. This is awesome. Thank
I'm
you.
glad you're enjoying it.
Thank you for taking us there. When we think about how do we develop that that rigor around our thinking and stretching our mindset, to become more strategic, what's the one piece of advice would you say to women that will help them develop their strategic mindset?
Yes, I'll tell you what I did. I'll give my example, and hopefully that's an example. I'm not going to say that's a tips, because it's easy to sit in somebody. It's not easy to sit in somebody else's shoes and give advice. It's only easy to sit in my own shoes and give advice. So I'll tell you what I did a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, before I formed Women in Power. I decided that I wanted to go study more about diversity, equity, inclusion. I didn't know enough about it, but so I spoke with about 10 to 15 different people who were experts in the field, at least in my eyes, or who I looked up to. And they all said, it doesn't make sense for you to go into a program because you're not going to find what you need. So create your own program. And that's what I did. So I announced on LinkedIn that I'm doing a self-funded fellowship. And my fellowship is going to help me read, listen, observe, reflect, and do the deep inner work needed. So that's what I did. I've been doing it. I'm gonna wrap up my 2 years at the end of June this year. But I think I'm tempted to continue another year into this fellowship. And it's important for me to call it a fellowship because then it forces me to do the work. No, it's not just about let's read a bunch of books and come up with what our thinking is. I'm really reading and reflecting on how to apply this. I, on average, will read anywhere between 10 to 12 books in a year. It's not a lot, I know that. People read much more. So, but I would say 10 to 12 books just focus on equity, inclusion, strategic leadership, inclusive leadership, just on those topics. And then I write down my reflections. I take extensive notes on these books so I can go back every time I need to think to a topic. Every time if I'm doing a workshop, if I'm talking to somebody, what are the key messages I got out of this? And I try and share them on LinkedIn so people who don't have time to read at least get a sense and gist of what the book is. But that is my muscle. That is what I do. That is what works for me, is reading, talking to people, listening, uh, reading short articles, reflecting. I say that really reflection, Evelyn, irrespective of what you read, whether a book or you listen to a podcast or you read a HBR article, a Howard Business Review article, or you even read just an article on Globe and Mail about women and leadership or strategic thinking, strategic leadership. Reflect, reflect, reflect. How does this apply to the work you're doing? What do you need to change?
I love that word apply.
Yeah.
We're in a project right now where we're thinking about skill development for folks. And the default tends to be, how do we train them? How do we train them? But the question is, how do we train them enough to ensure that the skill and the knowledge is then applied into the workplace? And that really requires people to reflect, to think about
Yeah.
how that material that they just went through, the practical applications of it in their daily work. And that's what
Yeah.
you're pointing to. You're pointing to the thinking and the reflection and the application of how it's going to make you a better leader, person in the workplace.
And personally,
Yeah.
right? Uh, remember I talked about context. Context doesn't just apply to programs. Context also applies to leadership, to learning. How do you contextualize what you've read? What does it mean? I read this, I'm paraphrasing what I read. There's an author called Meeta Malik, and she has a book about reimagining inclusion. And one thing she said that really stood out to me because I was like, it's so obvious yet so forgotten, is she says, inclusive leadership is a 24/7 job. You don't just think about doing it at work 9 to 5. You can't just come home and say, okay, inclusive leadership, you stay out, doors closed, I'll come back, pick you up at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's not how this shit works. The way it works is you bring it in with you. You have to apply it at work. You have to apply it at home. You have to apply it in the grocery store. You have to apply it at the airport. You have to apply it with your kids. It is 24/7.
Yeah.
So that's why contextualizing it, because it will look different at home and it's going to look different in the grocery store and it's going to look different at the airport and it's going to look different at work. Contextualizing that knowledge becomes important.
And it's transferable.
It
And
is.
and it will be the pillars, the concrete pillars of your confidence to make that
Yeah,
next move. I love
totally.
that. We've done the full circle there, Surabhi.
Yeah.
You are this avid reader, like you shared. Share with us one resource, if you could leave us with, that could help women really hone their crafts, and develop their leadership skills.
Oh God, I have so many recommendations. But I'll start with the one that I really enjoyed was Ruchika Tulshyan's book. And I can write it up and send this to you. It's
Thank
called Inclusion on Purpose.
you.
It's a lovely book, gives you practical tips. I absolutely love it. There's also a book called Shared Sisterhood by Tina Opie, and she has a co-author, and I'm forgetting her name right now. Forgive me for that. But she has this framework which is called the DIG framework, which is talks all about doing deep introspection for individual growth.
Mm.
So, so which is great. If people want to just have a cathartic reading about, how and feel like they have company in misery, I love Deepa Purushothaman's book, The First, the Few, the Only. And she shares examples of women of color who've gone through these systemic inequities, and some strategies how to overcome them, for sure. So, you asked for one. Of course, I've given you three. I
We're
can
gonna
give you
take them
more,
all.
but I think these are three good to start with.
Yeah, thank you. We'll create a library of all these
I'd
resources
love that.
and share them online. Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the end of our discussion, but I know there will be many more. And I'm sure the women listening to us have learned so much from you as I have. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, Surabhi. And thanks everyone for joining What Works for Women at Work. Surabhi is going to be so accessible. You're always on LinkedIn, Surabhi.
I am. I'd love for people to reach out, comment, connect with me on LinkedIn. If you're interested in talking more, just drop me a DM. I love to have chats. I've had many chats with random strangers. I love them. Do it. Let's do it.
So we're going to link your LinkedIn info at the bottom of our video, as well as your website. And so people can see all the things that you put out in the world and continue their learning. And so What Works for Women at Work will continue to bring people like Surabhi into the conversation to help us continue our learning. So stay tuned. In 2 weeks, we'll have another person to come in and share with us some wisdom as we continue our learning journey. Stay tuned. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks so very much.